So I'll start this two-part talk, and I'll be talking a little bit about deception in general. And the obligatory overview of the talk, I'm going to start by giving you a definition of what deception is. Then I'll talk a little bit about what researchers have done to detect deception. And then I will talk a little bit about truth detection. And then I'll quickly explain a little bit about how deception works on the internet. And then Alistair will talk to you for the remaining part of the study. So the definition of a lie or a deception is a successful or unsuccessful deliberate attempt without forewarning to create in another a belief which the communicator considers to be untrue. Well, that's quite a mouthful, and that's not really going to help much. So I'm just going to start by giving you some sort of classical examples. First of all, when we talk about lying, we tend to think that lying is bad. But that's not necessarily the case. There are, in fact, a lot of good lies. Sometimes they're known as white lies. They're lies in which basically we are expected to tell these lies, even if the person who we are lying to doesn't necessarily expect us to be lying. So because the person we are lying to doesn't expect us to be lying, we're still considered to be deceiving them. However, not deceiving them would be really weird. So you get situations like, thank you very much, I'm very happy with my home knitted poncho. You can't really go, you open your present and you get a home knitted poncho. You can't go, I didn't want a home knitted poncho. Why did you think I wanted a home knitted poncho? You have to say, thank you very much, I'm very happy with it. And although technically we are still lying in such a situation, doing anything else would be really socially awkward. And a second element in which we are deceiving people without necessarily doing something wrong is in situations where we are deceiving somebody who technically knows that we're lying to them, but we know that if we said, but you knew I was lying, they would just go, of course I didn't know you were lying. So you get things like this, like, I've read the terms and conditions. People almost always lie when they say that. They tick the box, I've read the terms and conditions, and they haven't. And of course, people who put in those boxes know that people lie when they say that. The point is they're using this to cover themselves, to make sure that they have all the boxes ticked. So because they're still saying that we expect you to tell us the truth, we would consider this lying, even though it's such a common and normal thing to do that it's not really what we would normally be interested in when we research lying. So the second thing I wanted to talk to you about a little bit is about how often do people lie? So how often is this deception happening? And in 1996, the Paulo et al. Did this big study in which they basically asked people. They said, you go throughout your day, and whenever you lie, you write it down straight away, and then you tell us. And they found that on average, students lied about twice a day, and other adults about once a day. Not sure what this says about students. So we could argue that, in fact, students are more honest, because when they lie, they'll admit it. But that's what they found. And also, which I think is quite nice in the studies, that they asked people, so why did you lie? Why did you do this? And that people almost always said, well, that it was part of that sort of good lying. I had to. I couldn't just say that she looked fat in that dress. It was a nice thing for me to do. And a little note on deception prevalence is that Sirota, Levine, and Boster in 2010 did a study that's very similar to what the Paulo and Ali did. So, whenever you lie, quickly write it down and then come back to us and give us all the lies you've told. And they found, in a certain way, results that were very similar to the Paulo and Ali's, that say that sort of people who are not students average about a lie a day. However, they found it is actually very unequally divided. So about 60% of the people said that they didn't lie at all in a day. And then about 5% of the people in their sample told half of the lies that were in all of the study, and only 1% of the people who participated told almost a quarter of all the lies. So it seemed to be the case in their study is you got a couple of people who are just lying throughout their day, almost the entire time. And then you got a sort of the large group of people who basically say, well, I don't lie at all. We can, of course, wonder whether they're lying when they say that, or whether they use some sort of definition of when they're lying that doesn't include these good lies or these white lies that I've just mentioned. But when we talk about deception, normally when we research this, we mean sort of bad deception, classic deception. So people who are telling one of these untruths in order to somehow gain. So because they're committing fraud or because they're accused of doing something wrong and that they don't want to admit to that, so they're going to deny that. Something that's been used a lot in research are alibis, people who are saying that at a particular time they were at a particular place. So those are the types of lies that most of psychology research has focused on. And this research has come up with three main theories of things that you can use to detect whether people are lying or not. And these three theories are stress, or somehow nervousness, cognitive load, and behavioral control. The first rule of stress says that lying is stressful. If you're going to lie to people, you're going to be nervous, you're going to be stressed, you're going to have all sorts of emotional responses. And those emotional responses we can detect. We can use those emotional responses to decide whether or not you're lying. The second theory of cognitive load says that lying is more difficult than telling the truth. And again, if you're doing something that's more difficult, there's going to be signs that you're finding this more difficult, and we can use that to detect whether you're lying or not. The third element is behavioral control. People who are lying are often or almost exclusively concerned with looking like they're telling the truth, which means that people who are lying are often trying to control their behavior. They're trying to look sensible and solid and truthful, credible. And that in itself shows off in their behavior. So you could see whether somebody's lying by the extent to which they are trying to control their behavior. At least that's what the theory says. And then if we look at a couple of different methods of detecting deception, so we have these theories that says we should be able to detect deception this way. And if we look at ways that people have actually used to detect deception, there's two ones I wanted to particularly point out. Psychophysiology, which I'm luckily going to have to say only once during this talk, but that's basically about machines. It's about Polygraph. I will talk about that in a bit later. And the second thing is different cues that people give off, so different verbal and non-verbal things. So what is it that they're saying? What is it that they're looking like that we can use to see whether they're lying or not? So the first thing I wanted to talk about is Polygraph. I think you've seen them before, maybe not in person, hopefully, but you've seen them on the telly. And basically what they do, Polygraph, it literally translates something like multiple measures, is that it measures several things that are all signs of stress. So it measures your heart rate, it measures your breathing rate, it measures how much you sweat. The more stressed you are, the higher these values are going to be. Your heart's going to beat faster, you're going to sweat more, you're going to breathe faster. And by measuring these signs of stress, the idea is that because lying is supposed to be more stressful than telling the truth, is that if you are showing these signs of stress, you are probably lying. I think you can catch the problem with this system is that it is assuming that you are not stressed because you have just been locked into a polygraph. Which, in reality, most people who are strapped into a polygraph are, because they have just been accused of doing something wrong, they've been accused of lying, and they've had a lot of things attached to them in order to test that. That's not the most relaxing environment most people have ever been in. So that's the main problem with these polygraph tests, is that they can make innocent people, truthful people, very, very nervous, and therefore give these false positives, where the machine is saying this person is showing signs of stress, this person is showing signs of lying, when in reality they're not lying, they're just terrified. And the second deception detecting methods I wanted to talk to you about are cues. So these are things that people do that other people can pick up on, which they don't need polygraphs or machines for in order to do that. So the first thing I want to talk to you about are verbal cues. So these are things that people who are lying say that is different from people who are telling the truth. And one of the most important elements is detail. In almost all research that psychologists have done, we have found that people who are telling the truth can tell about things in more detail than people who are lying. This is presumably because people who are lying have to make things up, and making things up is quite difficult. And people who are telling the truth can usually, because they have this sort of big memory of everything that happened there, they remember things. And if you ask them more questions, they can think back to what happened, even if they hadn't considered mentioning these things in the first place. If you ask them, they'll probably still know. The second big thing in verbal cues is plausibility. Almost by definition, because truth tellers are talking about something that really happened, what they're saying is more plausible, more likely to happen than people who are lying. Because people who are lying can make all sorts of things up, but the truth is usually constrained to the truth is constrained to what actually happened. Of course, really weird things happen to people, and sometimes that happens, and they talk about something that's the complete truth, and you would think, well, that never would have happened in a million years. But in general, people who are telling the truth are more plausible than people who are lying. And another element in these verbal cues, which is not as easy to pick up on, but which can be done using computer software and stuff like that, is you can look at the linguistics of the things that people say. So you can look at how often people use pronouns like he, she, it, I, and, for example, how often people use negations. So, for example, liars are more likely to use the word not. They are more likely to say that they didn't do things rather than to say that they did do things. The famous example is always Bill Clinton's "I did not have sex." And that's, people who are telling the truth are much more likely to say, I did this thing, rather than to deny that they did something else. Which is in part because people who lie often do so in denial of some sort of accusation. But still. Another important element in the sort of linguistic things is the fluency with which people talk. So because lying is more difficult than telling the truth, it often leads people to tell their story in a bit sort of a disoriented, pausing way in which things sort of get weighted and considered and thought about. But this is very dependent on how good liars people are. Some people are just really good and they can just smooth it all out and tell you the longest story you wanted. A second element of these cues is non-verbal behavior. So you can look at the way people look, behave. This is in a certain way more difficult than you think. So there's a lot of people who believe, well, of course you can tell they're lying because he wasn't looking right, you know, his eyes were wrong. And that is sometimes possible, but you got to remember with these non-verbal things is that they are very personal. People do things, the way people move their body when they talk is very specific to people. But one of the interesting things with these measures is that they are very influenced by behavioral control. So, for example, it is often said that people who lie look away, that they don't dare to look you in the eye. So what sometimes happens when you do these sort of things, you ask people, you know, would you come into the lab and lie to us, is that they make too much contact because they feel, well, I've always heard that liars look away. So I'm not going to do that. When I'm going to get to this interview, I'm going to make sure to keep looking at them, which is really creepy. Like this person on the first row is like, help. It's very noticeable. But that is a form of behavioral control. This sort of thing where liars feel, well, I can't look away because it'll make me look dodgy. And then they overdo it, which is something that does happen. And also, sometimes what happens is because liars are more stressed, sometimes they get these nervous tics where they move their hands. But at the same time, because lying is more difficult, sometimes what happens is people start becoming stiller and stiller, and not sort of really moving, which is in part because they're thinking so hard. So you have to think about what they're doing, what they've said, and then they don't really have time to also, you know, worry about their hair and make sure that sits straight. And they become really, really quiet. Which makes it very difficult to do any type of research of this, because you don't know whether somebody who's lying is going to be the nervous type that's going to do all the fidgety thing, or the hard thinking type that's going to sit very quiet. That's the problem with this research. Another thing is, what we have measured a lot is body posture. But again, you know, there is very large variations in the way people handle their lies. A separate thing I wanted to talk to you is something that I've called on these slides truth detection, which is not a technical term, but that's basically research in which instead of trying to find into the person sort of signs that they're lying, like that they're nervous or that they're thinking hard, instead you're trying to take what they're saying and find out, so is this true? Does this statement match up with what I know in reality to be true? Which is in a certain way a lot easier because you don't have to have these cues or these polygraphs or things like that. The downside is that you need to have an idea of what the truth is. And some of the research I do works in this way. So as Paul said, my own research is on intentions. So I'm interested in people who are lying about the things they're going to do. So, you know, I promise you I will finish this tomorrow. I really will. And one of the ways you can do that is that you could look at different reaction times tasks. And so what we know is that if people hold a particular intention, for example, they have to post a letter, and you ask them, you give them a computer task where they see words and they have to very quickly push buttons. This is a real word, this is a not real word. So you're just measuring how quickly they can do that. And we know that if you give people a word that is related to something they're intended, so if they're going to post a letter, you give them a word letterbox, they can say that that's a real word faster. Which seems to be because when people hold these intentions, they're sort of constantly sort of thinking about it. Can't forget to post a letter, can't forget to post a letter, can't forget to post a letter. And then when something related comes up, they can really pounce on that. So you can imagine somebody who has to post a letter and then they see that letterbox and go, oh yeah, letter, I had to post a letter. And because we know that people show these reaction time effects, we can use that. So if you say to me, I'm holding the intention that I'm going to post a letter, then I can give you this task and see whether you show such an effect, whether you can respond faster. And if you can, that's a sign that you really are holding that intention. If you can't, that's a sign that you're not, and then you might be lying to me. Another way people can look at this is through sort of identity matching. Alistair will talk about this a lot more and in much more detail than I do. But you could, for example, match what I'm saying to some aspects of the other behavior that you know about me. So if I told you I'm an English woman, technically that's a very short and easy lie for me to make. I'm unlikely to be stressed about it, mostly because I do a lot of lying in my work. I don't really have to think about it very hard. It's a very simple thing to say. And I'm not really controlling my behavior any more than I am because I'm giving this presentation. Yet I suspect that everybody in this auditorium knows that I'm not an English woman. Well, how do you know that? Because I don't sound like an English woman. That's a very big cue that I'm not an English woman. And that's a good example of this truth detection. You're not looking at me like, is she lying, is she not lying? You're comparing what I'm saying to something else that you know about me that's true. And that can give you a very large degree of security. So then if we move all of this research online on the internet, so how does what we know about deception change when we go to the internet? First of all, this is changing a little bit at the moment, but most of the things on the internet are written instead of spoken, which means that a lot of the body postures clues that I've spoke about aren't available to you. You're reading people's little letters. You can't see whether they're staring at you or whether they're moving their hands. And also, the fact that it is written means that the person who wrote it had the time. They could sit down and think about that. You know, when I'm talking to you, you can't just sit there and think. Well, you can sit there and think, but you look really awkward and really suspicious while you're doing it. But on the internet, you know, you can easily go, you know, be right back, think for 2 minutes, and then put your message in. And another important aspect from a psychological point of view of the internet is that you are more distant from the person you are talking to, both emotionally and physically. So if you're lying to somebody on the internet and they find out, that's fine. You know, they're unlikely to change you down. If you're lying to somebody to their face, things might get risky. Also, people on the internet tend to be people you are slightly less good friends with. Lying to your mum is a lot more difficult than lying to 123@hotmail.com. Just because you know your mum and your mum knows you, so your mum is more likely to catch you. Your mum is also more likely to be angry with you. And if she does get angry with you, you're more likely to notice. So that's where I wanted to end, because on the internet nobody knows you're a dog. You can do everything you want. Well, that's not quite true, but you can try. Thank you very much. Alistair will speak next on internet and fake identities.
Yep, so as Paul said, that's me. So I'm going to talk about fake identities online. So this is when you're lying about something about you online, whether that be who you are basically, so your age, your gender, and what else. I won't do a poll in the audience to see who has lied about something about them online, but I'd be very surprised if there's not at least one person who has, if not all of you. Anyway. So why do people fake it? So why do people lie about who they are online? It might be perfectly innocent, and a lot of times it is perfectly innocent. So, for instance, you might have privacy concerns with ongoing revelations recently, which I won't go into. But you might not want Facebook to know exactly who you are, where you live. You might not want Google. You might not want the internet widely to know exactly who you are, where you live, who your family is, everything about you. You might, for instance, separate work and home profiles. So you might have a completely different set of friends who you have at home and a completely different set of friends you have at work. And you might reveal different information to them. You might even lie about some information to help separate them. And there is quite a lot of people who pretend to be somebody else online. So there is people who, for instance, are happy being males in the real world, as it was, but online they pretend to be female, just for the fun of it, basically. So and there are perfectly innocent reasons for doing that. But then there's the not so innocent reasons. So, for instance, anybody who's got children here, especially if they're under 13, a lot of them will be on Facebook. Now, officially, you have to be over 13 to go on Facebook, as an example, and a lot of these online forums. But it is very easy to say that your date of birth is 3 years older than it is, and get past that filter. There's no checking done. So that's a common reason, especially that children use to get past these things, just lie about their age to get past that. Also, if you're doing something that's a bit nasty online, like, for instance, trolling, so you're winding people up, you're saying horrible things about people, you might not want to say that you live at this address and this is your name. So you might lie about who you are there, make up a fake identity to help protect yourself. And then we go all the way up to very serious crimes. So an example would be, for instance, anybody who's used internet dating. These are rife with people pretending to be somebody else. So somebody might be pretending to be a 25-year-old woman who has lots of money and is really interested in you, when in fact they're a 50-year-old male from some country somewhere, and obviously lying, trying to get money out of you. At some point they'll ask for some money for some emergency or something like that. That's quite common, so obviously that's lying about who you are for that purpose. There's things like radicalisation, so somebody might be posting extreme messages online, trying to radicalise people, and then some suicide bombing occurs in a country somewhere, and then the account goes quiet. A week later they come on saying, oh, I'm this person's brother, he was the person who did that suicide bombing, he's proven what he's said, when in reality it's the same person, he's just pretending to be somebody else. Obviously it would be good if you could detect that sort of thing, because then you could see that this person is lying about what they're saying. And the case we've done a lot of research in the past on the ISIS project, which was involved in a couple of years ago, was adults masquerading as children to gain trust. So this is basically online grooming, which hasn't got as much media coverage recently, but did do a few years ago. Oops, sorry. Obviously, with historical child abuse, that's more in the media at the moment. But this is happening a lot. People can quite easily lie about who they are online, groom children, and then aim to meet these children. Obviously, very serious crime, and if you can detect this, it would be useful. The problem with all this, so the problem with online communications, we've got millions of tweets every day, lots of more information. Policing this is extremely challenging. So despite what some people may say, there is nobody sat there reading all your emails and messages, because it would take far too long. You need some automatic processing to filter things out. So for instance, if the police sees a computer, they'll generally take the hard disk out of the computer. That might sit in a lab somewhere for 6 to 9 months waiting to be analysed, because analysing this data takes a hell of a long time. There are tools that help extract the data, but actually doing the analysis, a lot of time is actually sat there physically reading through chat logs, and for instance to find evidence. So anything that can be created to help automate this process would obviously be beneficial. It'll help alleviate that backlog. So, moving on to detecting fake identities, which is what I'm interested in. If you've got serious crimes, for the protection of young people online, but young people particularly we're interested in, we need to be able to detect these fake identities. As I said, this can be done manually, and there's well-established digital forensics methods for doing this, and there's an established area called forensic linguistics where people can do this manually, but this is very time-consuming unless you've got a lot of experience, and even if you have got a lot of experience, it's prone to error. So I work in natural language processing, which basically means automatically processing language, so surely we can use these sort of techniques to help this, so help filtering. We're not talking about fully automatic approaches here. We're using this to filter and say these are the people that you might want to look at, and then you might use manual approaches to look at them. So to use this, we basically look at what people write. So we look at the language that people use. So essentially, you are what you type, is what I'm hopefully going to show. So the experiment that we ran as part of the ISIS project a couple of years ago was in some local schools. We did something like a Turing test, if you've heard of a Turing test, where we had chat rooms set up with pupils from the school chatting to people, and some of the people they were chatting to were in another room that they couldn't see, and these were classed as strangers, and now half of these were other pupils in their class, and the other half were adults pretending to be children in their class. It was all perfectly safe. It was essentially teachers and teacher assistants at the school, but they were masquerading they were adults masquerading as children, or young adults, I should say. So after we did this chat experiment, we asked the pupils to guess the age and gender of the strangers that they were talking to. Does anybody want to have a guess at what percentage managed to get this right? Anybody?
90%.
90?
Yeah.
Okay, does anybody who thinks lower than 90%?
70.
70? Anybody think lower than 70?
Yeah, a little lower.
Go on.
I was about 20% or something.
Yeah, okay. So there's a few things there. The actual was 18%. They were absolutely rubbish at this. They had no idea who they were talking to. A lot of times, and the reasons they were given were basically something like, well, they said he was 30, he said he was 13, so I presumed he was 13. Things like that. You know, they were talking about the school, so they must know about school, so they must be a pupil at the school. Things like that. Really simple things, but they were rubbish at it. For gender, they were a bit better, so 58%, but still, this isn't much better than chance. A lot of the times, they weren't actually lying about the gender either. The adults were always lying about their age, but they wouldn't necessarily lie about the gender, although sometimes they did. But even then, they still only got a little better than chance. So what we want to know is if we can do some automated language analysis and basically do better than the children or the pupils, school pupils could do. Hopefully so. So to do the experiments, we extracted all the chat logs from this experiment. It's quite a small corpus, I will say that. So, and we have verified these results on bigger data sets, not necessarily that's got line involved, but this is one of the only data sets that actually has adults masquerading as children in it. So it's a small corpus, but it helps us to kind of test our system. So we use something called computational linguistics, which is essentially the same as natural language processing. Except for it's more linguistics-based, so it's more on the linguistics end, I would say. So we use theories from linguistics to look for things in language. And we use something called machine learning, which sounds fancy, but this is basically using statistics to use prior knowledge and then learn what things are. So machine learning is used, for instance, if you see these automatic cars that are becoming prevalent now, that's based on machine learning. Things like automatic translation, that's based on machine learning. It's quite well used at the moment. So I'm going to just talk, there's lots of different methods we use to do this, and what we're essentially doing is doing something called feature extraction, where we're looking for features in language that can help discern between certain groups of people. And I'm only going to talk about a few of the different methods that we use, because I could spend 2 hours talking about all of them. The first thing I want to talk about is something that we call stylistic fingerprinting. And these are quite basic things in somebody's language that are quite easy to count. So for instance, you can count how many times somebody uses exclamation marks. And it's quite well known in psychology, I think, that women, for some reason, use exclamation marks a lot more than men do. And nobody really knows why, I don't think. as far as I know. But it's there in language, so you can count how often people use exclamation marks, question marks, full stops, different punctuation characters like that. You can just look at the length of words that people use. So if people are using a lot of long words, you can say that might maybe say that they're older because they know longer words. You can also look at vocabulary measures. So this is basically how many different words that you know. Now that changes over time. So generally, as you get older, your vocabulary measures increase as you learn new words, obviously. So we can count all these, and then we can produce what we call a stylistic fingerprint. So we plot all these different values, and we produce a stylistic fingerprint that looks like these, and we can overlap these and see how close they are. So what we've got here is 4 different texts. So the texts are blue in all of these. So this is a new text that we've got, and we want to compare it against 4 different individuals. So there's 4 different individuals which are represented in red, and then purple is the overlap. And what we're looking for is the biggest overlap, and the biggest overlap says it's closest to this text. So in this case, you'd probably say this one looks quite close. There's quite a lot of overlap there. Not so much in these 2, quite a bit in there, so you might look at these 2. And in this case, this text is written by this person as an example. Okay? So we can then use this sort of things, and we can basically measure this overlap and use it as a way of predicting, if somebody belongs to that group. So we build these then we build one of these for all, for instance, adults, and we build one for all of the children, and then we compare a new text to both of them and see which one it's closest to. Okay? So to use that, this is quite on its own. Just using this method, we can get 75% accuracy at predicting whether someone's under 18 or an adult masquerading. So this is using the same data. It's not as good at gender distinction. In fact, it's quite rubbish at gender distinction. It's a little better than chance. Okay, so this is good for detecting ages, but not so good at detecting gender. And we're just using a very small set here. There are lots of other ones that we can use to improve this, but just with a very basic set, we can do that. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is words. Now, word usage is key a lot of the times for deciding who is, and just simply counting the words that different people use. I've said this before, but everybody's vocabulary is different, and it changes over time. As you get older, your vocabulary changes. You get introduced to new words. You get interested in different topics. You might learn new words. Who you talk to will influence your vocabulary. And everybody's vocabulary is different. Everybody knows different words. You'll probably know that if you talk to somebody who's a completely different age group to you, they might use words that you never heard of, things like that, if you get introduced to different technology, for instance. So we can look at comparing male speech to female speech, and we can look at what words are overused by males. So this is quite an old data, but this is speech data from the British National Corpus, which was collected about 30 years ago. They're currently collecting a new version of this, which will be great. But you can see which words males overuse. Now, gender stereotypes, the most overused words by males compared to females is a swear word, which I won't say. And then we have some other things like fillers, for instance, and yeah, I, and right. If you look at the words that females overuse, they say a lot of female pronouns, so they talk about other women a lot, so they say she and her. I'm not going to make any comment on this whatsoever. They say things like couldn't and wouldn't a lot. Interestingly, the next one along this, which I couldn't quite fit in, is Christmas. Is the word Christmas. Now, this is a word that's very much overused by the women in our household at the moment. So what we can do is count word usage and then compare against baselines for either males and females, or under 18s or adults masquerading. And any group we want, we can do this for any group we want and just compare. So we get a new text from a new individual. We want to say, is this person male or female? And we look at the word usage that they use, count all the words, count the relative frequencies in the baseline, and then see which one it's closest to, and then predict that as what we do. Doing that, just using the words predictively, we get 85%, we're getting 10% increase over the metrics, or the stylistic fingerprints, and that's for detecting under 18s and adults, just using the words that they use. And we get much better for gender as well, so we can get 78.5% for distinguishing between males and females. Again, this is just on the chat data. We have verified this with bigger data sets like Twitter, which is like 100 million words. And we get similar-ish results, slightly less, but similar-ish results. Okay, so far, I've ignored completely the fact that we're dealing with online language. So we're dealing with chat language here. If anybody's ever looked at any chat language or used any social networks, you will know that it's quite noisy, what we say is noisy. So you have a lot of things like abbreviations, like you'll see LOL and things like this a lot. And lots of shortcuts like using THNX instead of thanks, or the symbol @ And then you see things like emotion, what we call emotion indicators, so that these might be smileys, but you also have things like saying, this was so boring. I hope you're not going to say that about the talk. And then obviously you get typing errors and things like that, and misspellings. But you get a lot of this, and the language is full of these irregularities. So what? The problem with this is that if you're doing any language analysis, it screws it up a lot. So even counting words, if you've got the word, I don't know, tomorrow, for instance, spelt 5 different ways. If somebody's talking about tomorrow a lot, the frequency of that word is going to split amongst all them different ways that it's being used. The way that the research I've done, and actually my PhD research was on historical spelling variation, so this is the text from Shakespeare's time, which also has a lot of spelling variation, but a different type of spelling variation. And similarly, if you're doing historical linguistics, it screws that up. So the way that we do it is we pre-process a text and essentially correct this spelling variation. That's not to say that it was wrong to start with, although some cases misspellings it may have been. It's a choice that the user's made. But what we do is essentially what we say that we normalise the spelling, which basically means that we put it to a word that you find in the dictionary. So if we see this to M-O-R-A, we would change that to tomorrow in the text. Okay? And this means that your subsequent language analysis tools are more accurate. So another question for you. I went through and manually corrected the whole of the school chat corpus using a tool that I created for the historical work, which, I'm just checking what was next, because I didn't want to reveal the answer. So, from the school chat experiments, do you think that the adults or the under 18s use more what we call spelling variation, or? So who thinks adults? And who thinks of children or under 18s? I'd say more for the under 18s. So you've fallen for my cunning plan, obviously. So the adults used 23% of the words that the adults used were considered spelling variants, i.e. they weren't found in a modern dictionary or not a normal dictionary. For the children, it was only 13%. So the adults used a lot more spelling variation comparatively to the under 18s. So, interestingly, the children noticed this in the experiment. So we asked the children why they thought the person they were talking to was an adult or a child. And the ones who got it right, one of the main reasons they got it right is that they found that the language was fake. So if you look at these 2 examples, what they said, the bottom one, they used a lot of text language, so I think they were trying to sound younger. Yeah. Basically, and I've read all the text because I actually went through and not manually normalised it. The adults are just completely overdoing the spelling variation. They think that the children use a lot of text speak, but in reality, the children actually don't. They just type, a lot of what they type is quite just normal, very nice, everyday English. But because of the media representation of how children speak, they just completely overdid it. Interestingly as well, though, the type of text, the type of spelling variation that they used was different. So the adults use a lot more and a lot more what we call texisms. So this is using numbers instead of letters, for instance, or using single letters like using U and R, the letter R, to represent U as in Y-O-U and A-R-E. And they use a lot of, and we call these texisms because these are what appear in the media a lot. So you find them using things like mate as an M8. I don't think there was a single child in the corpus who used that. It's just, they just don't use that type of language. They use a different thing. The under 18s, so the under 18s did use quite a lot of spelling variation, so 30% is still quite a bit, but it was totally different. A lot of it was shortcuts. what we call shortcuts, and maybe carelessness, although it's hard to know whether they were just being carelessness or it was just a style thing. But they miss apostrophes a lot, so they would miss the apostrophe in can't and don't and I'm. And they'd run words together a lot as well. Does anybody know what that is? What you up to? Yeah, the younger people got it. Yeah, so they use things like this, whereas the adults didn't really use things like this. Some did, because actually interesting, some did after the children used it, so they learnt it from the children and then used it. So things like that. They probably didn't know what it meant, but anyway. There was examples of them asking what things meant as well, which probably gave them away a little bit. And they also use a lot of this repeated, what we call repeated character for effect. So they think like they say like so, like I said before, and just add lots of letters and do things like this. Like I really want some pizza. Things like that. So they did this a lot, whereas most of the adults were the text systems. So what we can do is use natural language processing techniques, some systems that are developed, to actually pick out these types of spelling variations. So we can look at how often somebody, for instance, is dropping a G from the end of words, which will pick out these, how often somebody's using the number 2 instead of TO. And you can pick that out automatically and use that to predict whether someone's an adult or child. So this is 82% accurate, or nearly 83% at distinguish between under 18s and the masquerading adults. And it's quite good at gender distinction as well. For some reason, the women in the corpus, or the girls in the corpus as well, use the number homophones a lot more than the men did. Don't know why, but they did. So you get this sort of, it's not as good as the words, but you get this sort of thing. Okay, the power of all this, so you do all these different things. So I've talked about the stylistic fingerprint and the words. We also look at function words, part of speech, which is basically how many nouns, verbs, adjectives you use, the frequencies of them. The topics, this is that people talk about. So, you know, men obviously speak a lot about football and sport, and the women talk about shopping. Not really, but that's the sort of thing that you're looking for. Character sequences, which we won't go into, but that's, you know, letter sequences essentially. Emoticons is an interesting one. You can do quite a lot of prediction just on what types of smileys people use, and like what letter people use for the nose is an interesting one. That's quite idiosyncratic, so you can detect an individual based on the type of smileys that they use, for instance. Different symbols, and then spelling rules, which is the one that I've just talked about. If we put all that together in what we call a classifier, which basically learns which ones of these are more powerful and more distinctive, we get, and use machine learning, we get, this is the final results, but I'm pretty sure I can improve on these with some more things. But for detecting whether someone's an adult or an under 18, we get 94.2% accuracy, so pretty close to getting everything right. And then for gender, not as good, but we still get 85% accuracy. And that's putting everything together. Hopefully we can improve on this a bit more. And like I said, this is on a very small data set, but we have verified this with bigger data sets, and we get not as good, but we're still getting, you know, 80s, 90% accuracy. So there's some final remarks there. I think I've run out of time. So I won't say that, I'll just leave them up on the screen. Oh, okay. So hopefully I've shown you that the people using these fake identities is not a good thing, and it's a tactic that cybercriminals use a lot. There's all sorts of problems with the dark web, for instance. At the moment, people generally don't reveal who they are in there. If you can obviously find out if somebody's doing drug dealing online, it'd be great to know where they're from, who they are, things like that. Basically, and because of the sheer amount of text, we need sophisticated techniques to be able to deal with these, okay? So we need to aid the investigators to be able to deal with the amount of text that's there and see if we can uncover these fake identities. It's important to note we'll never be 100% accurate. So even in a test, if we get 100% accuracy, overall, there's always going to be margins of error. So, and when we tried these tools out for the child grooming cases, it was always important that there was an investigator, an expert in the field who could actually go and verify. So the system might say that this person looks like it's an adult masquerading as a child, but they will then go and read the text and say, yeah, I agree with the system, and that will be used in evidence. So the tools that we're creating are not used in evidence, it's used as an investigative procedure. Saying all that, this is very much what we call a dual-use dilemma. We can use these for good, so we can use these for detecting cybercriminals, which you probably all agree is a good thing, But these similar methods carry with them privacy concerns. So if you're on Twitter, Twitter is analysing what gender you are with pretty high accuracy, higher than I'm getting actually, because they've got a lot more data, and they're then targeting adverts because of your gender. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's hard to know, but there's issues there that need to be dealt with. And like I said at the start, people are using different identities online for perfectly innocent reasons. Is it fair that these methods can be used to unmask them? That's open for debate. Okay?